All right. Okay. So thank you, Fabián, for the words. And I must say that it has been a pleasure for me to do my PhD here at the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. And I also wanted to say that I'm very happy to see so many familiar faces. And Fabián, could you also enable me to share my screen so that I can share my presentation? Okay, thank you. And so without further ado, I'm gonna get started. So my research project for my PhD is about the influence of soil drainage, tillage practices, and nitrogen management for corn and soybean production in the upper Midwest. A lot of soils in Minnesota, they remain under water saturated conditions for large portions of the growing season. And because of that, it is a very common practice to install artificial drainage to remove some of that excess water from the soil. And that has a lot of benefits. It allows for a better environment for roots development, which allows for more nutrient uptake. And it also allows for timely planting and harvesting operations. However, not every field is suited to receive artificial drainage, but are still cultivated as undrained soils, even though they have inadequate soil drainage. And just as an illustration, in Minnesota, for instance, 19% of the total cropland could still benefit from artificial drainage, but are still cultivated as undrained soils. And we know that soil moisture affects the soil nitrogen cycle, and there may be more denitrification losses under these undrained conditions. And when we have denitrification losses, we may lose some of that nitrogen fertilizer that is applied. So that indicates that there might be differences in the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that is needed to optimize corn production under drained versus undrained conditions. However, current guidelines for nitrogen management in Minnesota, they don't account for those differences in drainage condition. Another very common practice for corn production in Minnesota is to incorporate the crop residue into the soil. And that allows the soil to warm up and to dry out faster during the spring. But with climate change and spring conditions becoming increasingly warmer, there is also interest in the implementation of conservation tillage practices like strip-tillage and no-tillage for crop production. And these conservation tillage practices, they have environmental benefits. For example, you keep the crop residue at the soil surface so that we minimize the risks of soil erosion, which is important to maintain the fertility of the soils in the long term. So there is also a lot of interest in investigating how to best manage nitrogen fertilizer for corn production under different tillage practices and drainage conditions at the same time. And also to investigate the effects of these different tillage practices on corn and soybean grain yields. Most of nitrogen fertilizer is applied near planting time in the upper Midwest. And that's when it's more, there's not a lot of nitrogen requirements by plants. So that creates a mismatch between the time that fertilizer is applied for corn production and the time that there is more nitrogen uptake. And so that creates a larger potential for nutrient losses because there is also more precipitation and potential for losses via denitrification and leaching earlier in the season. So there's also interest in evaluating the utility of split nitrogen applications where you apply part of the nitrogen rate near planting and then another portion later in the season, under the assumption that we will minimize these environmental losses and increase the efficiency of nitrogen fertilizer application. Uh, while nitrogen applications are not common for soybean production, there are also reports that nitrogen fertilizer application under certain conditions, when biological nitrogen fixation is not the environment for biological nitrogen fixation is not favorable, there may be yield improvements with nitrogen application for soybean production. And there is also interest in evaluating different application timings for soybean production. And then, for instance, if we were to apply nitrogen earlier in the season, there may be a yield response if these early season conditions are not favorable for nodulation. For instance, if there is a lot of soil saturation or low soil pH and conditions like those that may prevent biological nitrogen fixation. But on the other hand, if we apply nitrogen early in the season and conditions are favorable for nodulation, this may only serve to reduce nodulation later in the season. And the other way around happens if we were to apply a nitrogen fertilizer later in the season, which may have a lower influence on nodulation, but also may be not as beneficial if early season conditions are not favorable for biological nitrogen fixation. So there is interest in evaluating how to best manage nitrogen fertilizer for corn and for soybean production under these different drainage and tillage conditions, and to see if there is any interactions between them. And so the main goal of this study was to investigate the influence of drainage condition, tillage practice, and nitrogen fertilizer management for corn and soybean production systems in the upper Midwest. This study was divided in 3 chapters. Chapters 1 and 2 are about the corn side, and chapter 3 is about soybeans. And I'm going to go through all of these during the presentation. I'm going to go through the materials and methods for the 3 studies all at once, because these studies were conducted at the same location and they share similar methods. Okay, so the study was conducted near Wells, Minnesota, on a corn and soybean rotation. And then in 2011, the entire field was tile drained, and drained and undrained blocks were created by leaving the controlled drainage structures fully open for the drained blocks, and the controlled drainage structures were left fully closed for the undrained. But the entire field had drainage, but we just closed the controlled drainage structures to create undrained blocks. And then the entire field was managed with conventional tillage from 2014 to 2016. And then within these drainage conditions and crops, we had different nitrogen treatments that we applied. And so this layout here was replicated 4 times in a randomized way. Starting in 2017 until 2020, we included tillage treatments. So we had conventional tillage with chisel plowing during the fall, and then spring field cultivation, and then strip tillage with the strips were created in the fall as well every year, and then no tillage where there was no residue. We just left the crop residue at the soil surface. And so this was the layout from 2017 until 2020. In terms of nitrogen treatments for corn, we had a full response curve applied near planting time, which we are calling PL for this presentation. And we also had a full response curve for a split nitrogen application. And this split nitrogen application had 45 kilograms per hectare applied near planting time, and then the rest of the rate to match the same amount in the at planting treatments at V6 development stage. So this layout here allowed us to calculate the optimal nitrogen rates for corn production under each of the different drainage conditions and tillage practices for a single pre-plant application or for a split nitrogen application. The nitrogen treatments for soybeans, so from 2014 until 2016, we had 5 treatments. So a check with no nitrogen, and then 45 kilograms per hectare applied at planting, or at V4, or at R1, or at R3. And the idea here was to investigate the effect of nitrogen application timings for soybean production. If, for example, early season nitrogen applications are more beneficial, or later in the season, nitrogen applications are better. And so to allow to make those types of comparisons. And then starting in 2017 until 2020, we had 2 nitrogen treatments. It was a check plot, so no nitrogen application, or a total rate of 135 kilograms per hectare applied in equal quantities at V4, or split applied in equal amounts at V4, R3, and R1. And the idea for applying these higher nitrogen rates here for during these years was to define whether or not there is a response, because if there would be a response, we would find it with these larger nitrogen rates. And another thing that I should mention is that all of these treatments here, they were cultivated in rotation with corn, but on plots that received the same nitrogen rate, so 135 kilograms per hectare. So there was no influence of the nitrogen rates applied on the corn growing rotation on these treatments here, because they all received the same nitrogen rates for these treatments. In terms of measurements, we calculated continuously, or we measured continuously during the growing season soil temperature and soil water filled pore space with soil moisture and temperature sensors. And we also had a weather station at the site measuring air temperature and precipitation continuously during the growing season. And one thing that I'd like to point out here is that during 2019, the study area was hit by a severe windstorm that caused a lot of green snap damage. And so to try to account for the effect of the green snap damage in the treatment effects, we harvested separately the damaged and the undamaged plants and considered the yield only from the undamaged plants to estimate the treatment effects in 2019. In terms of soil nitrogen measurements, we measured at different timings, so in season, at post-harvest, and at next spring, and different measurements as well. So nitrate and ammonium, and different soil depths, 0 to 30, 30 to 60, and 60 to 90 centimeters. In terms of crop parameters, we collected plant and grain samples for nitrogen uptake and grain quality determination. We also did canop sensing with rapid scan and VRE at V6 and V10 development stages, and determined grain yield at harvest. And the economic optimal nitrogen rates were calculated using a corn price of $4 per bushel and 40 cents per pound of nitrogen fertilizer, which were typical at the time that this study was conducted. Not as typical in today's date anymore. And then profit margin was the difference between the grain production minus the cost of nitrogen fertilization. In terms of statistical analysis, we used R in a randomized complete block design with a split plot treatment structure. We used mixed effects models. The fixed effects were drainage, tillage, and the nitrogen treatments. And then we also had the random effects. We calculated simultaneous confidence intervals to compare the categorical variables. So for instance, to compare drained versus undrained. And then we use regression analysis for the numerical variables and linear and quadratic plateau regression models. So with that, I'm going to move on to talk about the results from the 3 different studies. So study 1, drainage conditions influence corn nitrogen management in the US upper Midwest. And this study here was published with Agronomy now in December. So the objectives of this first study was so how does soil drainage condition and nitrogen application timing affect corn grain yield, optimal nitrogen fertilizer rates, and residual soil nitrogen in a conventional tillage system. So here in this first study, we are just looking at the conventional tillage component using data from 2014 all the way to 2019. So here in this first study, we did not look at tillage treatments. So moving on to the results now. This figure here, it shows the water field pore space in the y-axis here. And this red dashed line represents the field capacity. And then we have different colors for drained and undrained conditions. And so we have water field pore space measured continuously throughout the grain season in 2015 and 2016. And in the y-axis, in the right-hand side, we have precipitation, which is indicated by these black bars here. So here we are looking at 2015 and 16, because these were the most contrasting years, but we did this analysis for every single grain season. And some of the things that I would like to highlight here are, so first, in 2015, we can see that indeed, undrained soils had much more, the water field pore space was much larger compared to drained. And during a large portion of the grain season, it was above field capacity. And when soil moisture conditions are above field capacity, that is known to favor denitrification losses. However, in 2016, they were very similar throughout the grain season. And later, I'm going to talk about the results about grain yield in drained versus undrained conditions. And it'll be interesting to see that in 2016, there were no differences in grain yields, whereas in 2015, drained soils yielded much more. And just as an average across all of the different years, for drained soils, mean water field pore space was at 48%, compared to 57% in undrained conditions. And there were no large differences in soil temperature. So here we are looking at the results for grain yields in the y-axis, and we have the results for 2015 and 16. We have drained and undrained soils, and we have the different application times. So PL for applications, so for a single nitrogen application done near planting time, and SP for the split nitrogen applications. And it's interesting to see that in 2016, there were no differences whatsoever with regards to grain yield related to drainage conditions. However, in 2015, that had much larger differences in soil water field pore space. There were larger differences in grain yields, and drained soils tended to yield more than undrained. So it's very interesting to see that soil moisture conditions, they reflected really well what we observed in terms of grain yield. Here in this figure, we are looking at grain yield at the different years. And so for all of the different years, so we have drained and undrained conditions and the different application times. So the single pre-plant versus the split nitrogen application. And what I would like to show here is that for drained soils, a single pre-plant versus a split nitrogen application didn't make a difference in terms of grain yield, except for 2019 that had green snap damage affecting mostly the at planting or the single pre-plant treatments. So this indicates that for drained soils, it didn't make much of a difference in terms of grain yield, whether you apply nitrogen as a single pre-plant rate or if you split apply your nitrogen fertilizer. For undrained soils, there was also, for most of years, there were no differences, but in 2018, there was a stronger trend for greater grain yields with the split nitrogen treatments compared to the single pre-plant nitrogen rate. And that's because the 2018 grain season had very wet spring conditions with 186 millimeters above normal precipitation and also really high temperatures, or above normal temperatures, which likely favored a lot of nitrogen losses via denitrification. But overall, when we compare the different drainage conditions and nitrogen application timings, we can see that for drained, so there isn't much of a difference in terms of nitrogen application timing, and also for undrained, except for years that have really wet spring conditions. And overall, drained conditions or drained soils tended to produce about 1 megagram per hectare more than undrained, which is about 16 to 17 bushels per acre more than undrained. Now I'd like to switch gears a little bit here and talk about core nitrogen fertilizer requirements. So here in this table, we have the different years and the different nitrogen application timings. And we have the EONR and the grain yield at EONR for drained and undrained conditions. And the first thing that I would like to highlight is the 2016 grain season that tended to have the lowest UNRs, but also some of the highest grain yield at UNR. And when we look at the water field pore space for the 2016 grain season, we can see that they were, they were near field capacity and very similar for drained and undrained conditions during most of the grain season. And we know that when water field pore space is near field capacity, that favors nitrogen mineralization. So there was likely a lot of nitrogen mineralization going on in 2016 that made the EONR values be some of the lowest of all of the years. And another thing that I would like to show here is that undrained soils in 2016 ended producing more, so they had a greater grain yield at UNR than drained soils. And so this indicates that when environmental conditions are favorable, undrained soils can be as productive and as profitable as drained soils. Now I'd like to show the opposite side of the coin and look at the 2018 grain season that had a lot of precipitation early in the grain season. So for May and June, these numbers here, they show the deviation from normal for precipitation. So they were about 70 millimeters above normal in May and 120 millimeters above normal in June. And these values here on the bottom, they are the deviation from normal for air temperature. So they were almost 4 degrees above normal in May and 2.3 above normal in June. So this indicates that it was a very warm and wet spring in 2018 that likely favored a lot of nitrogen losses, both via denitrification in undrained soils and via leaching in drained soils. And because of that, the UNR values were some of the highest of all of the different years for both drained and undrained conditions. And another thing that I'd like to show here is that in 2018, it produced the greatest grain yield at UNR for drained soils of all of the different years. So even though there was a lot of nitrogen losses earlier in the season, it's also likely that there was a lot of mineralization going on later in the season. And if we can see, there's a large difference in the grain yield at UNR in drained versus undrained conditions. And this indicates that when early season conditions are very wet and warm, we will see the largest differences in grain yields between drained and undrained conditions. And this just as a summary from all of the different years. So when we look at the averages, the UNR for undrained soils was almost 40% greater than the UNR for drained soils, which is likely due to denitrification losses and a lower roots development, which has access to less nutrients and so on. But when we look at the grain yields at UNR, we can see that they are very similar values. And this is very interesting because this indicates that likely a lot of the nitrogen or a lot of the yield losses that we observe under undrained conditions are related to nitrogen deficiency. And if we were to just apply as much nitrogen as needed, those fields would also produce similar grain yields. However, this is not a very efficient way to produce and results in greater environmental losses. When we look at the split application timings, we can see that the UNR for undrained soils reduced a little bit with similar grain yields, whereas for drained soils, it increased a little bit and also produced similar grain yields. So this indicates that split applications for undrained soils are very beneficial because it allows you to reduce a little bit your nitrogen rate, but to produce similar grain yields. So now switching gears again, and we are looking at the residual soil nitrogen and the y-axis here related to the nitrogen rate differential from the optimal. So the 0 is the optimal nitrogen rate, and then negative values here are rates that were suboptimal. So those plots were under nitrogen deficiency. And the positive values are nitrogen rates that were above optimal. And we have different colors for different drainage conditions and application timings. And the main message from this slide here is that at the end of the growing season, regardless of drainage condition and application timing, you have similar amounts of nitrogen fertilizer in the soil. And when we consider that we had to apply more nitrogen to maximize or to optimize corn production in undrained soils, but end up with the same amount in the soil, that indicates indirectly that there was indeed much more nitrogen losses under these undrained conditions compared to drained. And another thing that I'd like to show here is that when we go from the fall to the spring of the next year, for nitrogen rates above the optimal, that there is an increase here in the residual soil nitrogen, but at the following spring, all of that nitrogen is gone. So over applying nitrogen fertilizer it doesn't carry any benefits to the crop that is grown in rotation. So in conclusions, soil drainage needs to be considered when making nitrogen management decisions. Artificial drainage reduces the amount of nitrogen fertilizer needed and increases grain yield relative to undrained, especially in wet and warm spring conditions. For undrained soils, the split application timing is a better option as it produces lower UNR and maintains similar yields. And the opposite scenario was observed for drained soils. Okay, so now presenting study number 2. Should corn nitrogen management be adjusted for tillage and soil drainage? So here we are also using the tillage treatments that started in 2017 and went until 2019. So the objectives of this study were to determine the influence of drainage conditions and tillage practices on corn grain yields and optimal nitrogen fertilizer rates, and to investigate the utility of in-season soil nitrogen content and canop sensing to guide nitrogen fertilizer application. In terms of environmental conditions, so water-filled pore space was, so here in this table we have the different drainage conditions and tillage practices, and we have soil water-filled pore space at 0 to 15 and 15 to 50 centimeters. And water-filled pore space was more affected by soil depth, as you can see that these values here are much larger than these for the 0 to 15. And they were also more affected by drainage condition, as these values here on the bottom for undrained were tended to be greater than the values for drained. And to a smaller extent by tillage practice. As we can see that just for drained condition and at the top 0 to 15 centimeters, there was a difference related to tillage practice, with no tillage having a greater soil water-filled pore space value. In terms of soil temperature, there were no season-long differences when we consider the averages across the entire growing season. However, when we look at just the month of June, conventional tillage in drained soils was 0.5 to 0.6 degrees Celsius warmer than the other drainage tillage combinations. So there was indeed a tillage effect here on soil temperature. Okay, so now looking at grain yield. Here we have grain yields in the y-axis for drained and undrained conditions. And we have different colors for the different tillage practices. And the first thing that I'd like to show here is that conventional tillage and strip tillage, regardless of drainage condition, always produced similar grain yield. And so this indicates that there is potential for implementing the strip tillage system as a conservation tillage practice without reductions in corn grain yield. And then when we look at no-tillage system in drained soils versus the other tillage practices in undrained soils, we can see that they were not different. So this indicates that the no-tillage system results in yield reductions compared to conventional tillage and strip tillage, especially for in drained conditions. So this indicates that there is a larger utility of the strip tillage system compared to no tillage for corn production. Now talking about corn nitrogen requirements. So here we have the different drainage conditions in the different tillage practices. And we have for the PL timing, so the single pre-plant versus the split treatments. And we have the UNRs and the grain yield at UNR for each of these conditions. And the first thing that I'd like to show is that conventional tillage and strip tillage in drained soils produced very similar grain yield at UNR and also very similar UNR values. So this indicates that nitrogen management can be done similarly for conventional tillage and strip tillage in drained soils. For undrained conditions, they also produced similar grain yields, but there were a little bit more differences in the nitrogen requirement or in the UNR when we looked at the different years. So there was no consistent trend for them being very similar during every growing season, whereas for drained soils, they were consistently very similar. And then for drained or for no tillage, we can see that under undrained conditions, it requires less nitrogen than conventional tillage and strip tillage, but it also produces less, has a lower grain yields at UNR than conventional tillage and strip tillage. And for drained conditions, it has a similar UNR, but also produces less grain yield. So this just highlights again that no tillage system has a lower utility compared to the strip tillage as a conservation tillage practice for corn production. And now we also investigated the utility of in-season soil nitrogen measurements to guide nitrogen fertilizer application. Here in the y-axis, we are looking at grain yield, and in the x-axis, we are looking at soil nitrate nitrogen values measured at the V6 development stage for drained and undrained conditions, and different colors for different tillage practices in 2017 and 18. So this is the relationship between soil nitrate nitrogen values and grain yields. And these triangles here, they indicate the grain yields at UNR and the amount of soil nitrogen that was required to reach that grain yield at UNR. And the idea here would be to use in-season soil nitrogen information to guide or to inform the need or not for nitrogen application. And the first thing that I'd like to show here is that there were no clear patterns for differences in optimal soil nitrate nitrogen values to optimize grain yield related to the different tillage practices or drained conditions. And I would also like to say that these values, they changed considerably. So for example, in 2018, the grain yield at UNR was close to 15 megagrams per hectare, and close to 10 parts per million of nitrogen were required to produce that grain yield at UNR. Whereas when we look at 2017, the grain yield at UNR was much lower, so close to 13.5, but we needed 20 to 30 parts per million to optimize that production. So this indicates that there's a lot of variability from one year to another in the optimal soil nitrate values. And that indicates that there is little utility for using soil nitrogen information to guide management decisions to say whether or not we need more nitrogen or not later in the growing season. And then we also investigated the utility of sensor-based nitrogen management. So here we have the different drainage conditions and tillage practices. And then we have the differential. So the predictions for the differential from the UNR, from the yield, and the margins for using the canop sensing at V10 stage versus the MRTN approach. And what we can see is that compared to the MRTN approach, so canop sensing at V10 was able to predict with closer to the actual nitrogen requirements compared to the MRTN approach. So the MRTN under-predicted the nitrogen requirement by about 60 kilograms per hectare compared to canop sensing at V10 stage that on average under-predicted by 22 kilograms per hectare. And this resulted, so managing nitrogen following the MRTN approach would have resulted in yield losses by 1.5 milligrams per hectare compared to 0.6 for canop sensing, and profit loss by 205 with the MRTN compared to 89 with canop sensing at V10 stage. So this indicates that for situations where nitrogen applications at the V10 stage are possible, so if there is irrigation to make sure that fertilizer can be incorporated, this seems to indicate that sensor-based nitrogen management is able to better quantify nitrogen requirements than using the MRTN approach. And another thing that I'd like to show here is that for no-tillage, there were the largest underestimations of nitrogen requirements compared to the other tillage systems and drainage conditions. And this may be because while we didn't measure nitrogen mineralization, this may be because there was less nitrogen mineralization after the time of canop sensing. So in conclusions, there is potential for the implementation of strip tillage as a conservation tillage practice in the upper Midwest, as it produces grain yields and nitrogen requirements similar to conventional tillage. Soil drainage has a larger influence on the soil water or tilled pore space and nitrogen fertilizer requirements than tillage practice. There is little value in using soil nitrogen information to guide nitrogen fertilizer application, and Inseason or canop sensing may be a viable option to manage nitrogen in situations where late season nitrogen applications are possible. And now moving on to the third chapter. So here we are looking at the effects on soybean production. So soil drainage, tillage practice, and nitrogen management. Implications for upper Midwest soybean production. The objectives were to determine the influence of soil drainage, tillage practice, and nitrogen management. So here we are looking at nitrogen rates and timing applied to the corn grown in rotation the previous year, or nitrogen applied directly to soybeans on soybean grain yield, grain quality, and residual soil nitrogen. So for drainage conditions, we saw a soybean response. So we have grain yield here in the y-axis and drained versus undrained conditions for the different years. We saw that there was a response to artificial drainage just in 1 year for soybean. So just in 2018, that had those very wet and warm spring conditions. So this indicates that soybean responds to artificial drainage only in years with excessively wet spring conditions, and that compared to corn, soybean is less responsive to artificial drainage. However, I should point out that if climate change predictions of increasingly wetter and warmer spring conditions in the upper Midwest, they come to be real, then artificial drainage will be more impactful for soybean production, as we can see here by the results from 2018. And so, as an average, drained soils produce 4.6 megagrams per hectare compared to 4.5 for undrained. So it's on average was a smaller difference compared to corn. There were no clear trends or clear patterns for differences in grain yield related to tillage practice for soybean production, with conventional tillage and strip tillage producing on average 4.6 and no tillage 4.5. In terms of the influence of nitrogen applications done directly to soybeans, there were no differences related to the different nitrogen application timings. So it didn't matter if we apply nitrogen at R3 or if we applied that before or at planting. And overall, the responses ranged from a negative response, like in 2014, where no nitrogen application produced more than nitrogen application, to positive responses, like in 15, where with nitrogen, the production was about 10% greater than without. And there were also some neutral responses for other years. So overall, there were also no clear patterns for a better utility of nitrogen application under different drainage and tillage conditions. In some instances, there were interactions between drainage and tillage, but they seem to appear more at random than to be related to any weather condition or anything like that. So in summary, nitrogen application increased grain yields by 2.5%, but decreased protein content by 7 grams per kilogram, and also decreased profit margins by $44 per hectare. And here we are looking at the effects of the nitrogen rates applied to the corn the previous year on the soybean grain yields for the different years. And we can see that there is no positive effect for increasing nitrogen rates on corn on the soybean grown in rotation the following year, regardless of drainage condition. And the only interaction that we observed here was a negative trend in undrained soils with increasing nitrogen rates from corn. There were decreasing soybean. There was decreasing soybean grain yields the following year. And this may be because 2018 was a very wet year, and so under those undrained conditions, for these larger nitrogen rates, there was likely more corn biomass in the soil that made it more difficult for soybean plants to develop. And so, in conclusions, soybean responds to artificial drainage only with excessively wet spring conditions. If climate change predictions of increasingly wetter springs are true, artificial drainage may become more relevant for soybean production. And also soybean is less influenced by soil drainage and tillage practice than corn. And nitrogen applications for soybeans are not recommended, either as direct nitrogen applications or as corn residual nitrogen application. So now moving on to the final conclusions and future research section. So the influence of soil drainage and tillage practice on corn and soybean grain yields requirements changes yearly and with weather conditions. Corn response to artificial drainage and nitrogen application is closely associated with soil water field pore space. And this creates some opportunities, because if we were able to quantify soil water field pore space at a fine scale in the soil, that might be a very useful metric to guide or to help guide nitrogen application for corn production. And then based on less nitrogen requirements and improved grain production with drained compared to undrained, having adequate soil drainage seems to be both agronomically and environmentally advantageous, especially for strip tillage is a viable conservation tillage practice alternative to no-tillage, as it consistently produces grain yield similar to conventional tillage for both corn and soybean, even though no-tillage was not very different for soybean production. In-season soil nitrogen information has limited utility to guide nitrogen fertilizer application, and there is little value in nitrogen fertilization for soybean production, either as direct nitrogen applications or as corn residual nitrogen applications. Future research. This study site in Wales has a lot of opportunities for continued research, and parameters like changes in soil properties like total carbon, soil bulk density, and nutrient stratification caused by drainage condition and tillage practice could be measured to quantify those changes over time. And also to quantify the influence of soil drainage and tillage practice on soil nitrogen processes like denitrification, volatilization, immobilization, and mineralization. So for my study, we were mostly focused on the economic aspects, but it would also be very interesting to see how those different drainage conditions, tillage practices, and nitrogen management components, how they affect the different parts of the soil nitrogen cycle. And to investigate the influence of soil drainage and tillage practice on corn grain yields and nitrogen requirements on different systems, for example, corn systems where there is much more biomass coming from one year to another under those different drainage and tillage conditions. So acknowledgements, I'd like to thank very much my advisor, Fabián Fernández, who has become a good friend over the years, and I'm very happy and humbled to have had the chance to work with him. I've learned so much working with Fabián, and we always had a very, very good relationship. So thank you very much, Fabián. I'd like to thank my committee members, Daniel Kaiser, Gary Ollert, Yoshin. Thank you, Gary, for always being patient with my emails with stats questions. I really appreciate you always being very helpful. I'd like to thank the Land Atmospheric Sciences Department, the faculty, and also the professors. I had the chance to take great courses in the LAAS department, and also the faculty, the staff was always very helpful. Carrie and Marjorie always helped me very much. So thank you all. The soils field crew, without whom all of this work would not have been possible. So Thor Seeley, Andrew Scobie, Nick, Darby, Jason, Eric, and all of the students that helped to collect the samples and everything. The Soybean Research Lab, Seth Nath and Victor Yaji. Seth worked with Fabián to implement and to design this study, and has always been very helpful and provided everything that was needed to conduct this study. So thank you very much, Seth and Victor. Graduate students, Sonia Menegas and John, that were my office mates during my PhD, and we always had a very, very good relationship working in our office. I feel very happy to have had a chance to share the office with you guys, and you're very nice friends. Tyler Negan, with whom we worked together for some projects as well, and Jared Speckman, who started his graduate studies at the same time that I did. We always work together for some of the projects. And the sponsors, the Soybean Growers Association, the Hugh Harrison Fellowship, George Rain Fellowship, the Man Drive Fellowship, and of course, my family and friends that were always very, very supportive. And with that, thank you very much, and I'll be more than happy to take any questions.
Very good. Thank you, Gabriel, for your presentation. We can give him a round of applause, virtual applause. And we will open this up now for questions and answers. And so if you have a question, what I suggest is either raise your hand or unmute your microphone, and hopefully unmuting the microphone will work unless there are too many people trying to do it at the same time. And there are a lot of people here, so hopefully I can see everybody. Okay, Melissa has a question, so go ahead, Melissa.
Thank you. Great presentation, Gabriel. It's really nice to see all of your work coming together.
Thank you.
One of the questions I had was for the tillage study. Did you do the economic analyses? It was interesting that like yields were lower for no-till, but you also needed less nitrogen. I assume you needed less money for the tillage cost too. So what did the economics look like for that study?
I did do some economics analysis, but I didn't go in very much detail for that specific analysis because I saw that there would be a lot of different components and moving parts. But if I remember right, I believe that strip tillage was with conventional tillage was more resulted in larger margins compared to the no tillage. But I don't remember on top of my head the number.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Carl?
Yeah, thanks. Great presentation, Gabriel. Really enjoyed it. Learned a lot.
Thank you.
I do have a question about your sensor-based research. What was that? Was that based on NDVI, or did you have some other algorithm? And also, is it just based on the pre-plant application of nitrogen? And were you able to do any prediction in terms of determining how much more nitrogen may be required based on that?
Okay, so I use the normalized difference, red edge, with the rapid scan. It's an active sensor. And I estimated the optimal nitrogen rates by sensing the at planting response curve with this sensor. And then I created the regression and found where the optimal value would be.
Okay.
Okay.
And then, so did you do anything with the split applications? So for example, would you be able to predict then whether you needed more using that?
Yes, and then I used the rate that was predicted with the sensors using the at planting response curve.
Okay.
And then I used the split response curve for the actual grain yield to determine how much would have been. So this is how I did my
okay, that makes sense.
So I used the at planting to do the sensing and determine what the rates would be. And then I used that rates on the split response curve to determine what the yield would be. So this is how I went about doing the predictions.
Okay, great. Thanks for the clarification.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there are a couple of questions among many. Congratulations here in the chat box from Les Everett. Are there parallel studies measuring nitrate in tile effluent in response to nitrogen application rates? And then the second question is, do we know how and how many acres N is applied in the fall versus spring pre-plant? Gabriel indicated that most in the spring pre-plant, but no, but do we know that?
So talking about specifically this study, so there are no studies being done to measure nitrates in the tile effluents in response to nitrogen application rates. And I'm not sure if the design or if if there would be possible using the tile drainage structure that we have at wells that collects from all of the different plots all together. So we don't have like it separated by treatment. Do we know how many acres? I don't know on top of my head how many is applied, but I believe that I already saw some surveys that indicated that there is more spring application compared to fall.
There is a question here from Brandy. She would love to hear about how some of your findings get communicated to growers, farmers.
Let's see. Which, sorry, is I'd love to hear about.
Yeah, Brandy Toner.
Okay, okay, I see here. Okay, so I have had the chance to present with Fabián for 2 or 3 seminars, I believe, Fabián. One was earlier this year for the nitrogen management conference. That is it had like 320 attendees, I believe, and a lot of them were farmers. But also in previous years, I have had the chance to present in field days in Huasica, if I remember right.
Gabriel is very humble because he has done a lot with that, has done a lot with communicating to farmers, even in some situations where I couldn't be present and he had like the opportunity to visit with farmers in the field, things like that. So he has done quite a bit. And I really appreciate that. From Anna Cates, do you have even a back of the envelope calculation about if, when, how long it takes for the increased corn yield to pay off the drainage investment?
I did do some analysis like that, considering different values to install tile drainage, because depending on the field, it's a different cost, and also considering different amounts of differences in grain yields. But I do remember that the time in years that it would take, it would range it from 7 to up to 40 years to pay off. But each field is different. If conditions are just extremely wet, then you may have no yield at all for some years. So it's a tricky one to estimate those things.
Very good. From Kyung-Soo, I am surprised by the relatively low impact of drainage on the yield, particularly considering its cost. How generalizable is your work to assigning the economic variability of agricultural drainage? And then there is a second question. I am also curious about the soil texture at your site and whether you observe earthworm differences between drained versus undrained.
Okay, in terms of how generalizable this work would be. So this study was conducted in southern Minnesota with a soil that is naturally poorly drained. So we could assume that a lot of soils would be under similar conditions to those. So I think it provides a very good estimate, like in general, of what could be expected for a lot of fields. But at the same time, it's hard to say because each field is different. But as a general, I think this study was located in a place that has a very common soil condition that can mimic a lot of other fields in the region or in southern Minnesota. And the second question, I'm also curious about the soil texture. So we didn't measure or didn't see differences in earthworm between drained and undrained conditions. And we did measure total carbon at the end of the 6th or 7th year. And if I remember right, there were no differences related to total carbon.
Very good. Are there any other questions? I don't see any more questions in the chat box, but if there are any additional questions, we can ask them at this point. Right, seeing none, we will again, let's give Gabriel a round of applause for his presentation and his work. And thank you everybody for being here, for the questions, for the support. As Gabriel mentioned, there are many people involved in this project, and I add my thanks to Gabriel's in terms of all the help that you have provided over the years for this project. With that, thank you very much, and have a great day. For the committee members, we will reconvene at, let's say, 10:10, so about 5-minute break with the new link that I sent a few days ago. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining in for the presentation.